Welcome, everyone. I just want to say how happy we are to see all of you. And on behalf of the Mikvah Emunah Society of Greater Washington, I want to welcome everyone to the fifth event sponsored by the Rabbi Nyman Mikvah Educational Fund. My name is Rachel Burnham, and I am a member of the Rabbi Nyman Mikvah Education Fund Programming Committee. I'd like to extend a special welcome to community rabbis and rebbitzins who are joining us this evening. Thanks to Zoom, we have people who may be joining from us from all over the world, and our goals are to create achdus in our community around our mikvah. If you are in the greater Washington area, we would love for you to identify yourself as a local by clicking on the reaction icon at the bottom of your screen and clicking on the clapping hand. Or feel free to raise your hand and wave if your camera's on. We'd love to hear from you. Yay. And for our local audience, here is a quick reminder that it is not too late to make a membership contribution to the Mikvah Emunah Society. As we emphasize each year, user fees alone do not cover the cost of mikvah operations. We depend on you to ensure that the mikvah remains an integral part of Jewish life and our local Jewish community. Your membership contributions ensures that we have funds for keeping a safe environment for women to feel secure, maintain our state-of-the-art facility and equipment, and provide a clean and welcoming environment for all. We are putting a link in the chat to mikvahemunah.com, and you can click there to make your membership contributions. Thank you so much. The link is currently below. For those who didn't know her, Rabbi Nyman was the manager of the Wallacey Mikvah here in Silver Spring before her Tzipporah almost 2 years ago. She was a renowned mikvah educator and a dynamic teacher and a social worker who transformed the experience of women going to the mikvah in many parts of the country. With the blessing of the Nyman family, the Mikvah Emunah Society established the Rabbi Nyman Mikvah Education Fund to honor Rabin's memory and perpetuate her legacy. We hope that our efforts pay tribute to the significant contributions she made to our community, especially to the practice of Taharas HaMishpacha. This fund is dedicated to her. It is dedicated to the training of mikvah attendants and greeters in our community and beyond, providing Taharas HaMishpacha and related educational programming, and sponsoring Kala classes for brides in the greater Washington, D.C. community who are unable to pay. Our Rabbi Nyman Mikvah Education Fund Programming Committee, made up of women from most of the shuls in our area, has been planning online events. If you missed any of our past events, feel free to check out our recordings from most of us at the events listed on the available website, mikvahemunah.com. And now for our program this evening. As some of you may recall, the very first Rabbi Nyman Mikvah Education Fund event that we held was a talk of the challenges that some women experience going to the mikvah. We heard from many of you that the mikvah experience can be colored by what is going on in your marriage, and many of our previous speakers have made clear healthy marriages are the cornerstone of Taharas HaMishpacha. Thus, I especially was pleased to introduce our speaker this. I am especially pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, Elisheva Liss. Elisheva is a licensed psychotherapist specializing in marriage and family therapy, and a highly acclaimed speaker who writes and teaches about sexuality education from an Orthodox Jewish perspective. She believes that parents and educators have an important role to play in ensuring that our children have healthy marriages. Elisheva teaches a popular online course called Sacred Not Secret, the Religious Family Guide to Healthy, Holy Sex Education. And we are pleased that she is giving us a taste of some of that content from her course this evening. After you hear Elisheva's presentation, if you are interested in registering for the course, we encourage you to use the link that we are about to post in the chat below. As some of the proceeds will benefit the Rabbi Nyman Mikvah Education. In addition, Elisheva has provided us with a discount of $20 for anyone on this call, and the code is MES. So the link is below. Before we get started, here are some housekeeping items. We have placed all participants on mute, and we ask you keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. The Zoom chat function is currently set up so that you can only send comments or questions to the host and our tech support, Chai Chin. Once our speaker finishes her presentation, I will be asking her questions. We will not identify you by name unless you ask to be identified. Elisheva, we look forward to your wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's really a pleasure getting to know some of you in the course of preparing for this talk. Can you guys give me a thumbs up that you can hear me all right? Okay, wonderful. Okay, let's get started. So Potchim Bechbod Achsanya, I want to just thank you and your wonderful organization for hosting this event. And I hope that Hashem will bless our efforts and that it will reach the right minds and ears and hearts the way it is intended. I also feel very, very honored and privileged to be able to say that I did know Rabbi Nyman, even though I live in New York. Towards the end of her life, Robin was living in New York as well. I had the honor of being in a supervision group. She had gone to school like as a second career. She had gone back to school to become a social worker. She was working with women in abusive marriages, really doing, very, very holy work. And I remember being so struck by her kindness. Everyone in our group was, it was all people who were in the helping professions and they cared, but Robin cared so deeply. And I remember thinking, like, if I was looking for a therapist at that time, like, I would love to go to somebody like Robin, because you felt her heart, you felt her caring. And I had the privilege of sitting with her in her home while she was working on some of the guidelines that she was using to train mikvah attendants, and the sensitivity and the thoughtfulness that she put into that, I'm sure, is reverberating throughout many mikvahs in the country. And it should be an aliyah for her neshama. I hope the learning that we do tonight will do things for her. I hope she'll, be proud of us. I still think about her. It's been a long time, but she really was such a special human being. So it's, a doubly meaningful honor to be here, in her name. Okay, so that being said, I want to dive in. There's so much that I want to be able to share with you, but like Rachel said, it'll just be a little bit of a taste. But I think the idea is to kind of get the ball rolling, because this is a topic that's really hard to talk about for a lot of people. Just because it's being hosted by a mikvah, I'll tell you like kind of a cute anecdote. I happen to live right next door to the mikvah in my community. I live in Far Rockaway, New York, right next door, like almost like sharing, like the courtyard of the mikvah is adjacent to my home. So we just feel very sort of like at home near the mikvah. One time years ago when my kids were little, we were at my brother and sister-in-law's house in New Jersey. And one of my kids said, Aunt Shani, do you have a mikvah around here? And my sister-in-law knows that, like, I have my own ideas about things. She's like, okay, why is your kid asking me for a mikvah? And I was like, I don't know, why are you asking? She's like, where do you ride your bikes? So that was sort of like their frame of reference. It's like, we're going to the mikvah to ride bikes. So I'm very open with my family, but sometimes it's just about riding bikes. The topic that we have for tonight is, the sacred, not secret, marital education begins in childhood. And it was the title, thought was put into the title on behalf of your committee, because they wanted it to be honest and true and real, but also delicate and sensitive and not too euphemistic. So they did not want to use the word sexuality in the title out of respect for the sacredness of the topic. But the truth is, as I was thinking about it, it was actually a very useful wide lens way to look at this aspect of education and of parenting, because it's more than just about sex. It's more than just about sexuality. It's really about investing in our children's relationships to themselves, to their bodies, to other people, to the way other people relate to them, and hopefully to, when they get to the right age, to their ultimate committed relationship. And so there is actually something almost like very poetic and prophetic about calling it, premarital education that begins in childhood. I like that very much. But my of course was already named, so it's got to stay what it is. I can't, and I'm not going to try and present a one-size-fits-all model or time schedule or script for all families, because I don't believe, I think that this education is more of an art than a science, and it needs to be, because like in any relationship, you don't write a book telling someone how to have a good relationship with your spouse and then give them all the scripts of loving things to say, right? You give them the principles, you give them the ideas, you give them the no-go zones, and then you allow for a certain amount of relationship and personality license for this to unfold. But what's different about this form of education is that it's something that has been very often taboo, stigmatized, uncomfortable, for a lot of people. And so we don't have that frame of reference. So I want to try to offer that frame of reference. I'm going to try to offer perspectives, suggestions, some sort of language for dialogue that we can think about and adapt to make it work for your own family. At this point, I would like to offer a trigger warning for survivors of trauma. It looks like we have about a couple hundred participants on this course. In this class tonight. And statistically, that means that we probably have a number of people who survived trauma, because the number is a lot higher than people think. And whenever we're talking about sexuality of any kind, somebody's asking me to speak slower. I'll try. That's always the critique I get. Whenever we talk about sexuality of any kind, it can trigger stuff, because especially if a person has sexual trauma, but even if they don't have sexual trauma, even if they have another kind of trauma, the nervous system can get triggered. So if you hear me speaking about things and you feel yourself getting activated, you can take breaks. I just found out that this class is going to be recorded, so you can come back to it, just do some deep breathing. If you're in therapy, you probably have tools and skills to be able to deal with it, but I did want to let you know, I don't intend to talk about anything graphic or explicit or, overtly triggering, certainly not intentionally, but trauma can be messy that way, and we don't always know what's going to trigger it. And I did want to be sensitive to those courageous survivors of trauma who still show up for programming like this. Okay. So one of the things that I think people who come to a class like this are not usually resistant. They're usually coming because they believe in the value of this kind of education. That being said, I still want to address some of the hesitations that come up when we are, addressing this topic, because sometimes you might think in the hypothetically, theoretically, like, oh yeah, this is a good thing to be able to do. But then, when it comes down to it, you have some of these hesitations. So I want to address them, because sometimes we can diffuse the blockages by just acknowledging, noticing, and knowing what they are, and knowing what to answer those inner voices as they come up. So a very typical objection that some people will say is, why do we need to put ideas in kids' heads? Let them stay innocent children as long as they can, right? There's plenty of time to teach them the facts of life when they're older, right? We come up with these phrases, the facts of life, the birds and the bees, like we get uncomfortable even referencing these topics. By giving them mature information, don't we run the risk of them taking this as suggestions? There's a widespread misconception that giving kids information about sexuality will sexualize children. Actually, the reverse is true. The more information kids have at age-appropriate factual levels, the less likely they are to act out sexually, because they have the knowledge of what yes and what no and what this means. They're not going to have to be going rogue exploring things. There's an example that I've heard multiple times. I've heard it, firsthand, and I've heard it from stories of, let's say, there's a 9th grade class in New York. The curriculum is 9th grade. They do biology. I guess that's probably somewhat standard. They do biology in high school. And you have 14, 15-year-old kids sitting in class, and the teacher says, okay, now we're going to do the reproductive system, right? And the kids start snickering and giggling. And inevitably, there's one kid who's going, what? I don't understand, right? And the kid really has no clue. And so the teacher is in this like awkward position of saying, you know what, maybe like go home and ask your parents. In contemporary public schools, there's been a big push this last year to offer more explicit sex education, even as young as 1st grade. I don't want to get too political about this, but my personal professional opinion is that I don't think it should be school teachers that are tasked with teaching about sex. I think that the first and primary trusted adults that should be teaching children is their parents or primary caregivers. But that being said, 9th grade is too old to not know. So, but this happens all the time. There's always invariably one 14, 15-year-old kid, and not even necessarily in the school systems that you would expect the kids to be particularly sheltered. Sometimes that also, but sometimes not. People just fall through the cracks, and it's embarrassing for that kid. The opposite, well, sort of a parallel story, which I've also heard a bunch of times, is let's say you have a birthday party, a bunch of 8-year-old kids, right? And some music goes on, and they're dancing and they're playing and they're enjoying the music. And one kid starts dancing in a way that's really provocative and suggestive, in such a way that the 8-year-old for sure has no clue that there's sexual innuendo, because it's an 8-year-old, they don't realize what they're doing, right? And so one parent thinks it's so funny and takes a picture and posts it on a social media account. And then the other parent is like, 1 second, you just posted this video of my kid doing a very, provocative thing. And it creates tension between the parents. It creates upset for the child. So these are just little examples of how not having the tools and the information can kind of run into problems in the parenting zone. So I don't want to use too many examples, because I'd rather give you principles, but I think sometimes it is helpful to learn via example. So I want to start by going through some common typologies of children with regard to how they relate to their own sexuality and the personal space of others, and see why each of these children would benefit from explicit sex education. And by the way, the theme that you're going to probably follow through most of the curriculum tonight, and in general, a lot of the material that I offer, like this is actually something I did want to mention. The stuff that we can't obviously get to everything tonight, I have a lot of articles, like free online content. If you go on elishevaliss.com, I have books that I recommend, really, really high quality books from a Jewish perspective. I didn't write these books. These are just books that I think are really good follow-up material, that some from a Jewish perspective, some from a general perspective, that you can then go ahead and follow up. So if you leave here with a lot more questions, that's a good thing. It means you're ready to learn more things. I'm just giving some broad ideas. Okay, so I'm going to give you 8 typologies of children, and why these typologies would benefit from being educated. Number 1 is the victim or a potential victim, right? Very often when people think about sex education, they think about sexual safety education, which is a really, really important aspect of sex education. It's actually not the topic I want to cover tonight, simply because I think that we do have a really nice amount of programming, more so than we did 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And especially within the Orthodox communities, we're doing a lot of really good catch up as far as sexual safety education. And which is a double-edged thing, meaning on the one hand, obviously it's fantastic, it's really important, we're probably preventing a lot of abuse and trauma. On the flip side of it though, what you have is a lot of young people, a lot of children and families who are now being educated about sexual danger and problems, and they don't have a clue about sexual pleasure, passion, relationships, and connection. And so they're walking in from the age of, let's say, preschool till mid-adolescence, when they start to learn this stuff, with only negative associations. And that creates a lot of problems when we expect kids, depending on what you're, at what point you introduce the idea of either coeducation or, dating for marriage, wherever you fall along the religious observance spectrum. If you've had a lot of years worth of pre-education for negative sexuality and dangerous sexuality, and then you expect people to think in terms of trust and connection and pleasure and desire, it's a really hard shift. So part of what I want to recommend and push for, and sort of advocate for, is that we balance this out by teaching children about age appropriate, and we'll talk soon about what that means, age appropriate information, but that creates sex positive messaging as well from a young age, that we're not limited to just this like danger zone. Okay. So number one is the victim, the potential victim, right? We all know there's some kids who are more likely to be targeted by predators. And the more forewarned and knowledgeable about their body boundaries that child is, the more likely they are to A, avoid situations, B, give off the vibe of like, you don't do that to me, and C, like, there's no secrets from my parents. Number two would be the sexually curious child. So those people who have raised more than one child have probably noticed that even if you give your children the same basic parenting, you're going to have some kids who are more like cerebral, some who are more creative, some who are more active, and some who are more sexually curious than others. And so that sexually curious child is going to want to get information, and we want to be the source of that information. Number three would be the physically unboundary child. So there are some kids who they need to touch everything. They always want to be touching, right? They're physically active. A lot of these are the ADHD kids, right? Those are the kids who are at risk of very impulsive behavior, where they could either aggressively or even sexually violate other people's boundaries. Okay. There's the aggressive child. We have the inhibited child, right? The kid who may have all these like thoughts and feelings and urges and puberty and questions, but they're not going to ask because they're too shy, they're too shameful, and they're going to internalize that shame, and they're going to take it with them into adolescence and adulthood. We want to be able to draw that child out and give them the info, like the Inoculation of daily show, the questions that they're not asking, we want to answer. And then we have the overly modest or scrupulous child, right? So depending again on which part of the community you're in, as far as how modesty laws are practiced, right? So a lot of kids are going to overly internalize, I don't do this, and I don't look at that, and I'm not allowed to read that, and I'm not allowed to watch that, and I'm not allowed to wear that. And then their whole sexual sense of self becomes a list of I can't. And then when we want them to be able to, be intimate in a relationship, they're just like, hold on a second. I only know about all the things I'm not allowed to do. How do you shift the script? And I see a lot of the young couples, probably the largest percentage of the young couples that I see for sexual dysfunction, we're often dealing with that sort of a dynamic, a sexually repressed, usually young woman who has internalized a lot of negativity around sexuality because of all the don'ts. Then we have the oblivious child, right? The kid who's just kind of a space cadet, like they notice the things that they notice, but they miss out on the other stuff. And again, because they're missing out on those cues, socially, physically, relationally, we need to fill in those missing blanks for them. And then we have like the regulated child, the kid who has like an average amount of interest, is curious about the dirty jokes, notices when they're hitting puberty. And that child, all of these children in different ways are going to benefit from us attending to and responding to their needs for knowledge at different ages. Okay, so I want to start with ourselves. I have like sort of 10 micro categories of things that we want to attend to. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on this because it's most adults who are, either sexually active or sexually educated, the information, right? You don't need me to teach you about sex at this point. But what we do need to do is check in with ourselves and see where our consciousness lies with regard to the topic. And then when we can attend to our own preconceived thoughts and feelings and notions, biases, hopes, wishes, things that we love, all of the whole spectrum of our own sexual paradigms, thoughts and experiences, we can then be intentional and mindful about how we want to give this over to the next generation. Okay, so the first thing I want to start with is, for a lot of people, there's discomfort, right? There's uncertainty. Sometimes we're self-conscious. Some people do have a lack of knowledge, by the way. But with the age of the internet and lots of really great reading material that has proliferated in the last 5 to 10 years, there have been so many more books and articles and videos. Even since I started lecturing on this, I would say also like 5 to 10 years, like there's just so much more out there, which is really wonderful to see. And there's a range of, because it's so socio-political at this point and so many stripes of, religious orientation, you can really like go shopping for the one that fits your own values. Lack of knowledge, people looking for the right vocabulary, having clarity of the goals. Sometimes people have shame and embarrassment. They feel like it's unnatural to talk about these things. A huge one, this is like one of the biggest questions that I get, is not knowing how much to share and when, how the words and thoughts are going to flow, not wanting to put things in kids' minds. There's the hashkafic spectrum, kind of figuring out where you fall as far as religious observance. That's also like a really big topic for parents. And what I often tell people is you don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to start sharing somewhere, and you can sort of like change things up along the way as they get older or as you learn more things. You also want to be able to try and anticipate the sort of exposure that they're going to have besides for these conversations and be able to preempt them and address them in a way that honors your values. Excuse me. The language, we want to find vocabulary that honors the values and the culture in which the education will take place, but also the accuracy that they're going to need in terms of understanding their bodies and the types of sexual activity that happen within bodies, even before they're sexual partners, right? Because as your body develops, right, as their sexual development happens, there's things going on that's, just within the person's body themselves. And that's why I'm not a huge fan of euphemism in terms of education, meaning I don't have a problem with euphemism in general when you're speaking publicly or when you want to teach kids how to talk about things when they're in school or when they're at a friend's house, but they need to know the proper biologically accurate names for their body parts so that even something as simple as like, I've heard people say like, oh, the first time I had a yeast infection, I had it for months because I was like too embarrassed to tell my mother. Like that shouldn't happen. Okay. Personal history. We bring a lot of our own backgrounds and stories to the table. How did we learn about this stuff? What messages did we receive and internalize? Where did that come from? What do we want to replicate or avoid when transmitting this information to the next generation? Do we carry current feelings related to past traumas, relationships, or our current marriage and relationship? To get in touch with our own experiences, our biases will help, keep that in check also. Peer concerns, right? Like A, what are they going to learn from their children and from their friends? And B, what would they possibly teach their friends? Age and developmental level. So we often avoid questions or opportunities to educate because people aren't so clear on how much to disclose at each stage of a child's development. So instead of like wading in the water and testing how much we need to go, people just stay on the land, but they miss valuable opportunities to prepare their children. And what I often tell everyone is there's not like a magic age to have one conversation. It is an ongoing dialogue that takes place over the span of their whole childhood and adolescence. So it's not like you have all the eggs in this one important basket and you can mess it up. I mean, obviously we mess up all the time as parents, right? But it's a conversation that takes place over the whole arc of their childhood. And it's less important what the age that they're up to is and more important what they're up to developmentally, what kind of questions that they're asking, what's happening in their body, what they're being exposed to, and what their interests are, because sometimes people will over-educate their children. Like they'll feed them a whole bunch of information at a time where the kid's clearly expressing like, I don't want to know all this right now. So it's important to track their reaction and tune in and pay attention to what's going on that child's end as well when we have these conversations, like we do in any kind of parenting, right? Individual personalities, kids have different temperaments, natures, level of physical awareness, level of arousability, right? There's some kids who are more like cerebral and they're just like not as tuned into their sexual selves, and there are kids who are very aware. And we want to make sure not to shame either one. Excuse me. The backlash, this is a big one. I know that like I've had this thought, like if I were raising my kids on a desert island, I would tell them A, B, or C, but a sense of responsibility, born of living in a certain kind of community or culture, it could be inhibiting, right? We have this illusion of sheltering and naivete that we think we're going to preserve. And we don't want to deal with being that parent that gets a call from the teacher that, oh, your kid said something inappropriate, your kid did something inappropriate. Right. So obviously we don't want our kids doing inappropriate things to other kids. But like I said before, by educating your child about boundaries, that's less likely to happen, not more likely to happen. There's this fear of sexualizing kids. Even without the worries of what people will think or say, we may hesitate to tackle these discussions because we want to give our kids the gift of childhood without them having to see themselves as sexual beings and having fantasies and thinking about genitals or seeing the opposite sex that way prematurely. Again, the studies consistently tell us that educating kids in an honest and respectful way, those are like the two running themes, honesty and respectfulness. That is not going to create obsessions about sex. The kids who are already obsessing about sex, they need that information because we need to give them a context for it. We need to contain it for them. We need to help them understand what their bodies and brains are doing very naturally because they're programmed to do that. And the kids who are going to be more naturally naive and oblivious and spacey, they're going to stay that way because they're just going to assimilate the information that we give them at a cerebral level until it becomes hormonally relevant for them to feel the feelings that are a very normal part of psychosexual development. Okay, and this is another really big objection that people have. What if I don't want my kid to think of me that way, right? I'm a parent and now I'm teaching my kids this is what adults do, and now my kid's going to be like, wait, you and daddy do that, you and mommy do that, right? So there's a very sort of across the board answer that I give people to say to their kids, and this is a really good tool to have. When your kid says, wait, you and mommy do that, you and daddy do that, what you say is like this: you can ask me anything you want about anything. You can always come to me with any questions that you have. But when it comes to the topic of sexuality, one of the ways that we respect others' privacy is that we don't talk about what other people are doing sexually with their partners. So you can ask me a question and I can say, this is something that people who are married to each other will do often when they're grown-ups, right? And you just always redirect it into the abstraction and say, yeah, when you're a grown-up, when you get married, you can do these things, right? And always deflect and say, you know what, it's not so nice people keep asking me to slow down. Okay, sorry. I just have so much that I want to tell you. You can listen to it on like 0.5 speed. Okay, I'll slow down. Take a drink. Okay. Yes. So in terms of like worrying about kids thinking about my mommy and daddy do that, eventually they're going to figure this out. Eventually they're going to be weirded out by it. And it's okay. Like, it's really okay that they're going to know, oh my gosh, this is something my parents do. But again, better for them to start that process. The younger they are, the less awkward it is, the less weirded out they are. Okay. There are 3 possible ways that this can come up. Number 1, it can be initiated by the child. So some conversations will be initiated sometimes unexpectedly by a child during the course of another dialogue or even like out of the blue. And on those occasions, you might need to think on your toes and like try to have some idea of like what to ask, what to tell, how much to share. There might be constraints on time, or there's other people around. At times like that, the best you can do is the best you can do. Just do the best we can, right? Reading and thinking about these topics in advance is a really good way to prepare for when this comes up. Like I said, there are books, there are articles. I share some of them on my website, but there's like tons more. Another really, really great tip is that when your kid confronts you with a question or shares a story or like kind of initiates this conversation and you're caught off guard and you don't really know what you want to say, or it's not a good time for you because you're in the middle of something, it's 1000% okay to say something like the following: that is a fantastic question, and I'm so happy that you came to me with it, and I'm so proud of you that you have such an inquisitive, curious mind that you want to know this stuff. But it's such an important question that I don't want to answer it this minute. I want to actually give it some thought and take time when we can really focus on it together. And that way you buy yourself a little time. You give the kid the positive feedback so that they know it's safe and it's good and it's healthy, that they're thinking about these things and that they can come to their parents or primary caregivers with these kind of questions. And you communicate to them that this is so important that I actually want to think on it a little bit. The trick is you really do have to come back to it because we don't want to be constantly pushing them off and then they feel like, oh, this is something my parents just don't ever want to talk to me about. But you can absolutely take a couple of days and then come back to it and say, remember that question you asked me the other day? I was thinking about it and I was talking to, your partner, or I did a little homework, or I spoke to the doctor or my rabbi, or somebody that I respect. There's no harm in telling your kid you did research, because one of the most wonderful things we can model to children is, if I don't know something, I can find out, right? We can learn things even as grown-ups. So that's when the child initiates. The next possible way that this could come up is when a parent initiates, right? Other conversations can be strategized. So you have that upper hand there when you say, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about. So you can plan to sit down at a good time with the child, or with, sometimes with people sometimes ask, like, I have twins, should I talk to them together or alone? And my answer is yes, talk to them together, talk to them alone. Like, These should not feel like huge monumental conversations. They're lots like an IV drip of positive information that we want to be giving them. The analogy I sometimes give is, if you want your kids to have good self-esteem, you don't sit them down one time when they're 12 years old and say, by the way, you're a good person, you have value, you should feel good about yourself. Now go on, have a good life, right? Like we want to kind of like drip in self-esteem building feedback throughout the course of their childhood, right? You want your kid to believe in God, you teach them about God in 100 different ways throughout the course of their childhood, right? Things that are values, things that are important, we find lots of different ways to interject them into the parenting and into the conversations that we have with them. Okay, so conversations that can be strategized, sit down with the kid, bring up the subject, guide the conversation the way you want it to go. These you can totally use scripts for. There is no shame in sitting down with actual notes and saying to your kid, this is so important that I actually made some notes because I want to say it exactly the way I want to say it. They might giggle a little, but that's fine. It just shows them that you take them seriously. And it's really wonderful for kids to feel like they're important to their parents. You want to go in prepared. And you may get some curveballs, like you may start a conversation and not be able to anticipate what they're going to ask. That's okay. Then you go back to plan A of like, wow, that's a really good question. I want to think about that, right? And the third way that it could be initiated is through circumstance, right? So you're walking in a public park and you see two people making out on a bench, just two random strangers making out on a park bench, and the kid's like, what are they doing? What's that, right? So, you didn't really bring it up. They didn't specifically bring it up, right? A circumstance came up. Sometimes even you're learning something in Torah. Like one of the things that I love to do is look for opportunities within like Parsha HaShavua or other Torah learning moments, because it really is such a great way to illustrate to children that this isn't something that's divorced from spirituality and religion. It's very much embedded in our values. Excuse me. So when it comes up with an incident, either, a positive incident, something nice, let's say they're at a wedding and they're asking questions, or an upsetting incident, unfortunately, every so often it comes out like, okay, there's someone in the community that's not going to be allowed to work in the school anymore. Or, I get calls every couple of months, someone in our neighborhood is going to jail. This kind of thing happens, and we need to attend to that also. We can use the opportunities to elaborate and educate. I remember once I was giving a class in my past life, before I went back to graduate school, I was a Tanakh teacher, and I was teaching a class of 12th graders, and I referenced the Yehuda and Tamar story. And there was an 12th grader, an 18-year-old young woman, a bright girl, who had gone through 12 years of Jewish education and didn't know the truth about that story because it hadn't been taught to her. She just knew a euphemistic version of that story. I think that, Tanakh stories are such a wonderful way to draw opportunities to talk about sexuality in a holy way. Okay, so something that Rev Hirsch talks about is inoculation and insulation. Insulation is wanting to sort of protect our children, and inoculation means giving them the information that they're anyway going to be exposed to from a framework that we want them to know it from. You're probably getting the picture that I'm a fan of inoculation, particularly in this day and age where it's my humble opinion, I don't really believe that people have the option and the luxury to truly shelter kids anymore. Certainly not boys. Some girls may grow up sheltered, but you don't know for sure that your kid is going to be sheltered. And even if your kid is sheltered, it's not necessarily a good thing. There's something that I call, it's not a real term, I made it up, Goldilocks sexuality. Remember how Goldilocks, everything was like too hot, too cold, too this, too much, too extreme. Something that we see a lot in, let's say, in marital therapy issues is hypersexuality and hyposexuality, right? Hypersexuality would be somebody who can't go more than a day without watching pornography or masturbating, right? Hyposexuality would be undersexual, someone whose sexuality never developed or got repressed, right? And we want to get it just right? We want to give our kids healthy, balanced context for sexuality. So we're looking to avoid sexual repression, aversion. There's literally something called sexual aversion disorder and shame. There's the classic paradigm case that I sometimes will get a call like, help, my daughter is supposed to get married in a month or 2 months, and she went to her kala classes and she's all freaked out and she thinks she's asexual. And now we need to make up for 20 years of sexual and non-education. Then there's the other extreme, the uninformed, unboundaried exploration. So this is sometimes cases of childhood sexual experimental behavior gone awry, kids developing, an interest in pornography, particularly at a young age. And so you have this split of, the hypo and the hyper. And sometimes you have both, right? You'll have someone who identifies as like, oh, I don't do those kind of things, like either for personal reasons or religious reasons, or they're intellectual, but like then they have like a secret sexual life that no one else is allowed to know about. And so when it comes time to share their sexuality with an intimate partner, they don't know how to do that because sexuality has always been this like very secretive, shame-based experience for them. When we give them the vocabulary, the language, the normalization, the validation, the holy context for it, they're able to integrate, they're able to understand, they're able to practice within their own thoughts and bodies. They recognize that this is normative and this is good and this is healthy and this is a process for a preparation for when they get older. There are essentially 6 primary ways that kids will learn sex ed. One of them is from other children. Another one is from sexual predators. Another is online content, printed material, videos, or pornography, even if you don't have any of that stuff in your home. Another one is through their own bodies and minds, their thoughts, their feelings, their sensations, their spontaneous arousals, fantasies, nighttime emissions. Another one is much later, right? So they're oblivious or repressed until late adolescence or early adulthood, or right before their wedding. And that's often a very traumatic way to find out. And the 6th way, which is obviously the way that, that I like best, is from a trusted, knowledgeable adult, preferably parents, and preferably gradually. One of the main messages that I like to get across when we talk about healthy, holy sex education is that sex is holy. There are really hundreds of biblical examples that we can give, but one that I like to mention is the very first, according to one opinion, the very first commandment in the Torah, the very first mitzvah is to procreate, right? Not immaculately, right? Unapologetically. God could have started with the 10 commandments. He could have started with Shema, like he could have done Shabbos, kosher, but he started with this loving message of, I love people and I want you to love people. So there's this way that you can make more people by being very intimate with other people. And it feels really good, right? Enjoy yourself. Please do it, right? First mitzvah in the Torah, not apologetic. The holiest book in Tanakh is called Shir HaShir. And by the way, the second mitzvah, according to that counting of mitzvahs, is bris milah, which is also not exactly a G-rated mitzvah. So the Torah does not shy away from these topics. And these are really great opportunities to insert, every year you do Parsha, you can always add a little bit more. The holiest book in Tanakh, according to one opinion, is Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim is an erotic love story, and it's called Kodesh Kodashim, Holy of Holies. And it talks very explicitly about love and passion and specifically about the human body. The genesis of sexual shame is also in Genesis. Initially, it says that Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, were in the Garden of Eden. They were nude and they were not ashamed. Then once they defied their command, right, what they were told to do, they deviated morally. And that's when they started to feel shame and aware of their nudity. God makes them clothing and they learn to channel their desire. So one lesson from this story is obviously a very rich story, very deep and confusing story. But one takeaway is that nudity plus innocence plus judicious knowledge from God is life in paradise, right? And there's no shame. On the other hand, nudity plus ignorance plus stolen knowledge and moral deviation results in shame, hiding, and estrangement, followed by the need to repair. So again, if we can get our, ki yitzir chaganid and bikedem, if we can get in that like very innocent, very pure, very holy messaging in before it becomes a forbidden fruit, then we're giving our children such a wonderful gift. The hope is to preserve that primal innocence that they're born with, right? Babies aren't ashamed of their bodies. So that they won't be so tempted by sexual activity that's forbidden, unhealthy, exploitive, or sinful. And instead, they're going to be able to partake of the beautiful, delicious, holy pleasure that actually is what God wants us to have. There's context for sexuality as well, because it's so much more than just making babies. I remember I had a friend who, and she wasn't terribly sheltered at all, actually, but she just put like 2 and 2 together and got 6. And she thought that, let's say there were 4 kids in her family, that meant her parents had sex 4 times. Because that was how babies were made, right? It's not even such a crazy, she was the first person that I heard say that, but I've actually heard other people say that too. There's so much more to sexuality than baby making or attraction or flirtation or genitals or arousal or intercourse. It actually speaks to there's a difference between sex and sexuality. Sexuality is a broader umbrella category that speaks to our relationship with our bodies, ourselves, our relationships to others. It begins with self-awareness and a desire to connect, a curiosity to explore, a need to self-express, and instincts to give and receive pleasure. Our sexual identity is possibly our most prominent characteristics. It's observable in newborns. I wrote this before the debate around sexual identity and gender identity has become so front and center in the news. And I don't want to go there so much today, but I feel like I need to nod to it because it's a really important topic that definitely also relates to Orthodox Jews as well. But the example that I used to give, which is feeling less relevant, is people would say, "Oh, they had a baby. Oh, really? What'd they have?" Like the understanding was like a boy or a girl. Another thought I wanted to bring up was the love and affection that we practice in our homes where the children are raised, both between the parents and themselves and from parents to children, provide a direct model and framework for kids to observe love, relationships, connection, touch, different kinds of touch, and form paradigms about themselves in the future. Like I said, I don't think that it needs to be like that. It should be one earth-shattering conversation. I really like when families are able to try and incorporate messaging about sexuality into the gradual chinuch that they cover in general. Let's start with, let's say, the youngest age of children. Most people would say that sex education isn't really relevant to toddlers, but I actually think that we transmit body messaging even in infancy, right? There are very powerful studies that discuss the nature of parent-child attachment styles and link them meaningfully to physical touch. Babies have been known to seek comfort in utero, thumb sucking, and other self-soothing habits. And it's pretty well known that babies that are orphaned, who are held and cuddled, thrive, while those who only have their physical needs met, right? Like let's say they're only fed and diapered, but they don't get cuddled, they develop failure to thrive. So, and sometimes caregivers will observe like a genital response to the stimulation of an open diaper or being rinsed by water. Like babies respond to touch, even in their genitals. They're not sexual. It's not appropriate to see them as sexual, but their bodies are already working that way. I notice sometimes that when we engage with babies and toddlers, we tend to be very instinctively physical. We stroke their cheeks, we put out our arms to hold them, we hold their hands when walking. They elicit a lot of nurture and a lot of affection and touch from us. All these acts of loving touch are preparing their developing nervous systems to be able to enjoy and respond to human touch as a source of connection and pleasure. Something that's very hard to see is when adults or older children insist on holding kids or kissing them when they're clearly like protesting or grimacing. That's the opposite of the messaging we want. And people do it, they don't do it maliciously, but it's really the opposite of consent. We don't want to ever be like trying to push our affection on children. We want to be reading the room and saying, okay, this kid clearly doesn't like. I remember saying that to when my kids were little, like if the bigger one was trying to like cuddle or lift one of the youngest, look at her face. Does she look like she's enjoying that? No. Okay, so we need to stop, and so I think there's sometimes grown-ups that need to get that memo also. Sometimes we do need to hold a child, dress, diaper, or wash them against their will. We try very hard not to like have to overpower them. We try to engage them and make it more pleasant. Sometimes you have to just take them somewhere that they don't want to go. And that's just part of the normal task of parenting. But to impose affection on a child to gratify one's own need for physical touch is not, we don't want to be doing that. If you already did that and you thought it was cute and funny, you're not a terrible person, but just stop. Okay. There is also some evidence that people who are severely punished corporally, physically as children, might have trouble with loving touch later in life. I've seen it in my own practice. Kids who were, smacked around a lot, if they start to associate people's touch and hands with fear, it's hard to undo that. It can be done, but it's hard to undo that. Ideally, we want touch to be primarily a positive association. So these are a lot of examples of how even in terms of babies and toddlers, giving affection, honoring their body boundaries, and showing them, receiving and giving touch with them, obviously not in a sexual way, but there is a continuum. Touch isn't just affectionate or sexual. There's sensual. There's a whole spectrum of experience in the middle, and the nervous system responds to all kinds of touch that way. I'm skipping around some of my material because the time is going too fast for some reason. Let's move to kids. Kids are natural scientists. They love to explore and question. They're also social creatures. They love to connect. They also like to explore their bodies, and they also are very interested in exploring other people's bodies if they don't know that they're not supposed to do that. At a young age, it's relatively innocent. They want to give each other the chills. They want to braid each other's hair. And even if they want to play doctor and, look at each other's private parts, those are all very normal things. People are sometimes like, my kid is a terrible, I just heard something terrible. My kid asked their cousin to show, we pull down our underwear and show. Kids do this, right? This is natural for kids. What we need to do is educate them and say, yes, it's interesting to look at your private parts and other people's, but it's not okay. It's not appropriate. So we don't want to be freaking out. We just want to be educating. And ideally, we want to be preemptively educating, not doing so much damage control. Although it's not always a parent's fault if a kid ends up doing this kind of thing, because sometimes they had the idea on their own, or they were influenced by another child. We don't need to catastrophize it. We just need to talk about it and educate and attend to it. Yeah, there's no need to panic for that. It's part of sexual development, psychosexual development. Kids tend to talk and question a lot, sometimes more than we have patience for. We have so many opportunities to use their running commentary on the world to insert our own perspectives. So I'm going to give you like just a few different examples of times that come up that we can talk about things. So let's say you have a 2-year-old or 2.5-year-old who's in the middle of being toilet trained, maybe a 3-year-old, and wants to show everybody, look at my big boy or big girl underwear, right? How do we deal with that, right? Think about how you want to talk to them. A 4-year-old grabs his mother's breasts while sitting in her lap, right? That's an opportunity to explain what breasts are and why we don't want to be grabbing them, right? You're bathing your child and he or she keeps trying to play with their private parts, right? We want to talk about that. A 5-year-old asks how a baby comes out of its mother's body. Great opportunity for education. This is a good biology lesson. I have like so many of these examples. Let's skip to like an older age, right? You're changing a toddler's diaper and an older child looks on and says, how come bodies have to be so ugly and gross, right? A lot of kids get this messaging that bodies are ugly and gross. Kids who know and respect their body parts in an uncomplicated way and understand what the body parts do and how they evolve through puberty are more likely to feel good in their own skin, to take care of their own health and hygiene, to feel more good about themselves and attractive, to respect their own boundaries and other people's boundaries. They're more likely to come to their parents if someone's making them uncomfortable and address their own temptations before things happen. Kids who know there are never secrets from parents, no matter what, are more likely to be able to protect themselves and avoid dangerous seclusions and circumstances. This is not a guarantee. This is just, we want to sort of increase the chances of, or sort of decrease the chances of abuse happening and increase their toolbox of how to handle situations that make them uncomfortable. When they develop their own urges and thoughts and feelings and crushes, they'll know that this is normal and healthy, and it's preparing their brains and their hearts and their bodies for future love relationships. As they get older, they'll look forward to and feel worthy of love and pleasure and connection. They'll have the clarity and vocabulary to discuss needs and desires and concerns with their partners, and the knowledge to seek help when difficulties come up. Sometimes when I talk about this, it's not that kind of like, if I talk to a live group, I'll say, how many people had some form of higher education? People will raise their hands, and I'll say, how many people feel that we got a good form of planned education around social skills and relationships and love and sexuality that prepared us for adulthood? And then like you see so many of the hands go down, so few people really feel that way. And that's something we want to change, because while most of us would readily agree that our priorities and life values are more about our relationships, our families, our relationships to our bodies, and love than they are about trigonometry and physics or even work, we spend so much time and money and energy investing in academics more than we do in kids' psychological well-being. And so my hope is that the parents of this generation will begin to, be the change. I want to try to wind down a little bit because I want to leave time for your questions. I think that if you're uncomfortable having these conversations, it's not ridiculous to practice in front of the mirror, to practice with your partner, to do some research and kind of find the language, experiment a little bit with it. If a kid asks them a question, if your kid asks a question, ask them what they already know. Clarify what they're asking. Don't like overeducate. Don't dump too much information on them at once. There's plenty of opportunity to kind of drip it in. Here's a big one that I feel very strongly about. Don't ever criticize your children's bodies or other people's bodies or even your own body in front of them. I mean, ideally, don't criticize anybody's bodies, including your own ever. That would be like a nice place to get to, but certainly your kids should never hear critical words about bodies or, food restriction, anything like that, because that also plays into feeling, they're feeling comfortable within their own bodies. Fantasy, masturbation, these are normal parts of development. Best for them to hear about it from you rather than from their own brains and bodies or from friends or from TV or pornography. As I mentioned before, we don't really have time to get into the whole unit on LGBTQ topics, but my humble opinion on this, regardless of how orthodox or observant you are, is that children need to know that this exists, because statistically, regardless of where you fall along religious community spectrum, there are children who are going to find themselves attracted to the same sex in varying degrees. They need to know this is a thing. The Torah does talk about this. And I would talk about it, at least when I talk about it publicly, I would say just teach them in a very neutral way, right? What does gay mean? Gay means when two people that are the same gender or sex love each other, right? That's what it means, right? We can just give them the very factual information. We don't have to attach a lot of value judgment and shame with it, depending on, again, what values you want to add to it. That's not something that I'm comfortable sharing to a large group, but that can be adapted within your own family. But it's the kind of thing that's really, really hard to talk about, both in terms of the socio-political side of it and the religious side of it, because we're at a point in human history where we're still learning how this works in terms of human nature. So I would just be very humble, be very factual, and be very gentle. Okay. The primary messages we want to give over to children over the course of their childhood is: your body belongs to you. Your body is a holy gift from God, and it's wonderful. That touch is something that should feel good. And if it doesn't, then they're empowered to say no. Touch is a way of showing love, and there are different ways of showing love at different stages of life and within different relationships. Some are more appropriate at this stage, and some are more for when you get older. And that sexual touch is exclusively for adults in consensual relationships, committed sensual relationships, if that's your religious orientation, and is more for and is for both pleasure and passion, as well as sometimes procreation, reproduction. Okay, I'm going to wind down my part now because I really want to leave time for questions. But I just want to say that our hosts tonight were the Mikvah Society, and the linguistic root of the word mikvah is very similar and connected to the word tikva, which means hope. It is my hope that we are able to offer hope to the next generation, to be able to enjoy the gift of their body, their relationships, their sexuality, and be able to do these mitzvos with more health and happiness.